Good morning, Parkway. Great to see you guys. How's everyone doing? Hope you're having a good morning. My name is Scott DeSanders. I'm the discipleship pastor here. It truly is a privilege to get to worship with you guys here, and I'm really excited. Hope to get to meet you later. If you're a guest with us especially, we'll tell you more about that as we close. But we are in the third week of our Hope in the Wilderness series right now, where we're following the story of Exodus as God sends Moses to deliver his people, the Hebrew nation, from their 400 years of bondage and slavery in Egypt. And along the way, we're getting to see how God can uniquely speak to us in the midst of wilderness times or seasons in our lives. And he can offer us hope and grace and beauty, even in the midst of challenge, right? Last week, we saw the climax of 10 plagues of judgment against Egypt as the firstborn across the whole nation faced death unless they were covered by the blood of a sacrificial lamb as a substitute. And then Pharaoh relented and eventually let the people go. And through the institution of the Passover meal, the Hebrews celebrated God's protection and provision and deliverance. And then they gathered up their lives and they mustered together for a climactic departure out of Egypt to head face first into the desert wilderness. That's where we were last week. And that takes us to today, where our theme is God's rescue in Exodus chapter 14. So let's think for just a second, what does that mean to be rescued from something? I want us to consider that concept of rescue for a moment. Maybe you've experienced rescue when someone comes to pull you out of an awkward conversation, you know, that kind of setting, or maybe you've seen that happen and you're like, why did that person just take them away from me? Hopefully not. It also makes me think of those old Life Alert commercials, I've fallen and I can't get up, like, ooh, now I have security that rescue is on the way to come and help me. There's actually also something really unique about when some of us men become fathers. All of a sudden we become superheroes, able to rescue our little ones from imminent danger all the time. Y'all check out this little montage of those. Pretty impressive, right? Any dads out there had a moment like that? I'll say I've got a decent example of a time that I got to be a superhero, and it wasn't with one of my boys. Years ago, when I was youth pastoring, I was teaching on a middle school Wednesday night to some of my 7th and 8th graders, and I had this one 7th grade student, a little shrimpy kid named Dylan, and he was a really chill kind of guy. Like, he gave off surfer vibes, and I'm pretty sure he was a competitive water skier, that kind of personality. And so that night, I was up on the stage, kind of like this, teaching, and Dylan was in the front row, like right in front of me. And he was snacking while I was talking, of course, just vibing out. He had a can of orange Fanta he was downing, and then a candy box of, those old atomic fireballs, those bright red little spicy jawbreakers. Well, while I taught, I noticed Dylan's face getting redder and redder, and I looked at him, and I was the only one that noticed this. He was giving me the international sign of choking. He was doing this stuff. So I jumped off the stage, and I quickly got him onto his feet, and I moved myself behind him, and I gave him a couple quick Heimlich thrusts, and out came this torrent of orange and red. It was disgusting. All onto the floor, and he looked at me with watery eyes, and he was like, "Thanks, dude." And he just sat right back down, and I went back to teaching. And There we go. That was one of my most heroic moments of life. So since we're talking today about being rescued or rescuing somebody else from something, let's make sure we're clear with our terminology. Because last week we were looking at the Hebrew people being delivered from slavery in Egypt. And so I would say when we think of those two concepts, rescue versus deliverance, we could define them like this. Let's think of rescue as being saved from peril or harm or death, something really bad that's imminent. Make sense? Versus, let's think of deliverance as being freed from a longer status, like captivity or bondage or slavery, but being released and taken out of a long-term season of suffering. See the difference there? Today, our focus is on a story where God steps in to absolutely rescue his people from imminent danger. But I want you to start imagining right now, before we dive deep into the text, have you ever experienced God rescuing you from danger? What was the last time you found yourself in a desperate situation with no way out? And if so, was your solution to look to the Lord for help? Do you truly believe that God can, or that he does choose to intervene into our lives and come to our rescue? These are good questions for us to contemplate and to understand the events of chapter 14 of Exodus best. We actually have to pick up at the tail end of chapter 13. So if you've got a Bible, open up to Exodus. We'll start at the very end of chapter 13, where it says this: when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So this is picking up from where we were last week. The Hebrews have been released from slavery. What a triumphant moment that must have felt like to them, you know? Imagine the morale of the people at this point, having the supernatural, visible, tangible presence of God right there with you. There's no mistaking, like, are we on the right path? Are we doing the right thing here? Because you have God leading you literally in front of you. This would have been absolutely one of those spiritual mountaintop moments. And it's interesting to me that the Lord chooses to take them on a more southern route, deeper into the wilderness, instead of a coastal direction up by the Mediterranean. Evidently, the Philistine people would have drawn the Hebrews into conflict a lot sooner, and God in his wisdom knew that this would demoralize his people. So instead, he leads them south. And of course, some of us are like, well, they get demoralized anyway. That's going to happen. They're going to eventually complain about returning to Egypt no matter what. But it does seem like taking that northern direct route to the promised land could have been all that much worse. So let's pick up in chapter 14 now. The Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they're wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Y'all, I find this part fascinating. The Lord intentionally backs the people up against the sea. He maneuvers them into a dead-end situation with no way out. You see that? Why would God do that? Isn't he supposed to be leading the people to the land of promise? So why is he leading them instead up against the water? One scholar views this as the Lord operating like a master chess player, prompting Pharaoh to move his king piece right into checkmate position. You see that? It's almost like setting a snare. And yes, using the people as bait temporarily, so the Egyptians will see them like sitting ducks, like shooting fish in a barrel. So that's a first piece of what's shaping up to be a pretty desperate situation. God himself is leading the people into a helpless position where they cannot see a way forward. And then look what happens next. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed towards the people. And they said, what is this that we've done, that we've let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. All right, now the situation's going from bad to worse. Now they're stranded next to the ocean, and they've got a bloodthirsty army of former oppressors in hot pursuit. Surely Pharaoh and the other Egyptian leaders are thinking at this point, they're looking up at their home turf and the abandoned Hebrew city, and they've lost their entire labor force overnight, you know? And they're probably regretting their decision, thinking, why did we let them go? Is it possible that maybe dealing with a few gnats and frogs and some hail might have been worth it to keep these folks around? And so he sets off with his royal army in pursuit. And y'all, this is anything but the setup of a fair fight. This would be a complete blowout. There's a pastor out there that calls this a matchup of an elite team of commandos versus a ragtag multitude of overburdened tourists. That's what this is looking like. And I wonder, does any of this resonate with your own experience? In your life, have you experienced situations that feel like they've gone from bad to worse? Whether you've chalked it up to bad luck or misfortune, or maybe you sincerely have wondered in the moment, what's God up to? It's a familiar place for many of us to feel like things in our lives have gotten out of order. And I think it's important for us to take a minute to consider an important concept coming up in these verses, which is Pharaoh's hardening of heart. Did you notice that? Repeatedly in this section of Exodus, we read that Pharaoh hardened his heart against Moses or against God or against the people. And even more important for us to consider, it speaks to the Lord doing that hardening sometimes. Look back at verse 4 where it read, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Y'all, this terminology of a hard heart, it appears 20 different times across Exodus 4 through 14. And there's actually a handful of different Hebrew terms being used here. One of those terms speaks as if the heart were heavy, as if the organ were no longer functioning properly, no longer responding to outside stimulus, as if it was made of stone instead of flesh. Other terms refer to strength, but not in a positive way. It's not like calling Pharaoh strong-hearted. It's more like calling him bullheaded. Make sense? So Pharaoh started to experience this hardness of heart back during the plagues, but clearly it's rising back up here, even after he's relented to letting the people go. And so in chapter 14, this hardness of heart is causing him to pursue the people of Israel with a death wish. The question I would ask is, did God do this to him? Did the sovereign Lord manipulate a human's feelings and mind and decision-making? There's a commentator, Victor Hamilton, that asks these kinds of questions. He wonders it this way. He says, is the scripture implying that Pharaoh, now so impervious to God, has forfeited his right to choose consciously and independently? May freedom be abrogated? In other words, is he giving up free will here? At least for a while, Pharaoh had control over his own choice, but never did he exercise control over the consequences of his choice. So it helps me to think that, yes, Pharaoh was growing impervious to God. I like that phrase. It makes me think of something that should be pervious that grows kind of crusty and full, like cheesecloth. Who uses that anymore? But it should let something flow through, and then it grows where you can't flow through it anymore. So I can remember that Pharaoh grew that way on his own. He didn't need any help to grow more rigid, inflexible, unreceptive to the Lord's leadings, the Lord's plans. He opposed the bigger picture of what God was doing. And over time, he only grew more and more resolute in that status, right? But it also seems likely that God helped solidify that process, either accelerating or reinforcing the man's inner position. It's like God allowed and endured Pharaoh's bullheadedness. He didn't create it, but he also willingly allowed it to propagate. We also have to acknowledge the good grace of the Lord, which had attempted numerous times by this point to soften Pharaoh's heart, to turn him in the opposite direction. The same commentator brings up the following ways that the Lord moved toward Pharaoh to soften his heart before it was fully hardened. First, Pharaoh asked Moses to pray for him, to go before the Lord to pray for his heart. Second, his own magicians told him, hey, this is the hand of God. Third, God moved Pharaoh multiple times to partial obedience, to start to allow the people to go and make sacrifices to their God. Even though you can't go fully yet, I'm going to allow you some wiggle room here. And then fourth, Pharaoh even partially recognizes his own sin a time or two, even though he doubles down and just keeps on going in it. So let's cap off our consideration in this way, thinking of it like this. Let me ask you this way. Are you growing a little crusty towards the sovereign will of the Lord? Are you allowing yourself at times to resist God's plans? Do you find yourself sometimes opposing his ways in the world? If so, that might be the beginnings of a hardness of heart. On the other hand, are you trying to remain soft and malleable and sensitive to the Lord, desiring that his will be accomplished both in your life and others? If so, he's going to be able to continue to speak to you more clearly and to work in you. So getting back to our story, the people are backed into a corner, and now their arch enemy is hot on their trail, and things are looking pretty desperate, which takes us to what I would phrase as our first point today. I'll put it in the form of a question to ask you guys like this. When God leads you into desperate situations, will you depend on him? It's going to happen, y'all. God's going to give you opportunities to trust him or to not. So what will you do when the moment comes? What will you do when you get that difficult update about your chances of conceiving? What will you do when your time of unemployment has gone on months longer than expected? What will you do when things sour in that important relationship in your life and you wonder, could it be salvaged? I'm telling you all today, God will allow these types of scenarios to rise up in our lives in order to teach us to depend on him. And what's more, he will even nudge us towards those scenarios. So, as for the Hebrews, let's see how they respond to their desperate situation. Let's read starting in verse 10. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we might serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Impressive, right? It's one of those moments of like, you speak to your mama with that mouth. This represents, I'd say, the first of many occasions of a pattern that continues through their time in the wilderness where the people gripe and complain and whine to Moses and to God about their circumstances. And we can kind of understand their perspective, you know? Like here, they're sandwiched between the ocean and an encroaching army. And yet, the way they bring up Egypt so longingly, as if their ancestors hadn't been crying out to God for hundreds of years to be saved from their slavery, and the way they glamorize how much better they had it before the Lord intervened, all of this, y'all, is evidence that they're starting to reject God's will in their lives. That's ultimately what it comes down to. They're partially experiencing a new reality brought on through God's sovereignty, and they're rejecting it because it doesn't feel safe. Or in this case, it feels illogical and desperate. And yet their reaction still feels so human and so relatable. It's impressive how quickly we can forget what God has done for us, isn't it? It's so important for us to remember what God has done in our lives, to ingrain it onto our hearts and souls. One of my favorite professors in seminary, Dr. Allman, he put it this way. I've memorized this for all the years since. He says, what God has done in the past is both a model and a promise of what he will do in the future. And Allman says, but he's too creative to do the same thing twice. Isn't that cool? In other words, we can hold on to the good things that God has done in the past, the ways he's shown up for us previously, and we can trust that he's going to continue to do so in the future, even when the situation's looking bleak. Y'all, in some cases, it's not just that we're doubting if God can save us, which would be a situation of, does God have the power to do this? Is he big and strong enough? In some cases, our doubt is, will God do this? Will he choose it? It's as if to say, I trust that God could change this thing for my life. I'm just not sure his character is trustworthy. I'm not sure of his heart for me. If he doesn't change this thing, how could any alternative be better? Could I really trust his plans if they're different than mine? That's what it often comes down to. In the Hebrews case, what's clear is that you can take the slaves out of Egypt, but it's a whole nother matter to take the slavery out of them. And here they are suddenly longing for the comfort of their former status. Maybe they didn't have freedom, but at least they had meals every day and shelter. And I think it's funny how much desperation can warp our perspective and cause us to not see things clearly. In the Hebrew people's response, we can see a fear that's wrapped up in panic, and then it leads them right into cynicism. You see that? Which is familiar to some of us. Fear takes over in their hearts, and a people who just recently were praising God with song are now spitting out venom with sharp and pessimistic words. And it all stems from the fact that they've taken their eyes off of God. We have to acknowledge, y'all, this is part of how we're built as humans, though. It's known patterns of neuropsychology out there that when we get into fearful, panicky circumstances, we tend to have predetermined and habitual ruts that we slide right into in our responses. There's three big ones out there that people have studied and understand about us. First, maybe you have an instinct to fight back against the situation, to find the enemy or the opposition that you're facing and attack it before it can harm you. Even if it leads to you just boxing against the air, that instinct is attack back. Or maybe it's the second one for you. Maybe your gut reaction is to get the heck out of Dodge, to pick up your heels and flee the situation, to get away from danger and get yourself to safety. If you can remove yourself from the situation, all will feel better. Or maybe it's not either of those, and it's the third option here, where your first instinct is to freeze up. Maybe fear grows so powerful it just paralyzes you. Or it's the old Jurassic Park T-Rex thing, where if you hold very still, nothing will see you and you'll stay safe. You know what I'm talking about? So think about it for yourself. Is there one of these that's a prevalent instinct for you? Do any of these sound familiar? Like every time a situation turns anxious for you or feels desperate, you slide right into these instincts? And I wonder, how much more effective could we be if we could start to recognize those patterns before we fall into them and interrupt them and choose to depend on the Lord instead? So speaking of which, let's look at what God tells the Hebrews after they're complaining and rejecting him. This is how the Lord answers them through Moses in verse 13. Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." Y'all watch this. God gives this cool 4-part strategy for when we're feeling desperate, when we feel like we're backed up against the wall and our natural instinct is to fight back or flee or freeze up in inaction. Instead, what if we practice these 4 things? First, do not fear. This says, I'm going to choose to not live in fear. I'm going to reject the instinct to wallow in fear, sit in fear, and I'm not going to let it overwhelm me. Second, stand firm. Instead of crumbling and falling back, I'm going to remain steady. I'm going to plant my feet. I'm going to dig deep, and I'm not going to be easily moved. The third piece, look to the Lord. I know my enemy looms large in front of me, but instead of focusing on their strength, I'm going to keep my attention on God, and I'm going to watch for him to move. Now note, y'all, this specifically looks like looking to the Lord, not human sources of power or strength. And right now, there's a current temptation for some Christians to heap a whole lot of extra loyalty or faith into governmental institutions as a source of salvation. And that is not what the Lord is talking about here. He's talking about looking only to him. And then finally, he says, be silent. Because my temptation may be to scream or to wail and moan or jab back with verbal barbs, but instead I'm going to choose to silence this whirlwind of negativity in my heart or in my head so I don't miss any of the moment of what God's about to do. You see those 4 things? I hope you can notice the Hebrews were doing the exact opposite of all 4 of them. They were panicking, they were wanting to run away, surely some of them were ready to fight back, and they were absolutely griping and complaining. But if you look at God's prescription, those 4 different components, it really is a picture of the gospel. In your desperation and sin, there is nothing that you can do to contribute to your salvation. You don't get to save yourself. Only God can. And we're not talking some kind of passive gospel where you just sit back and do nothing. You still get to move forward in obedience and acceptance of God's grace, but let's be clear that God's greater rescue in your life is never a case of the Lord helps those who help themselves. When he intervenes to save us, only his power will suffice. We cannot save ourselves. You guys agree? So that leads us to our second point of consideration today. Again, I'll put it in a question to you. When your back is against the wall, will you turn to despair? Will you act like the Hebrews? Will you forget what God has done for you? Will you freeze up? Will you flee? Will you try to fight back? Or will you choose to reinforce your trust in him? Even this very week, I've had the opportunity to put this into practice, y'all. As Wednesday, I came down with a pretty nasty fever and cough, and I contracted the flu. Midday Wednesday, not a great timing for someone preaching on Sunday to fall victim to illness. And I guarantee you guys, there were instincts in me to panic. I had a lot of negative thoughts. I felt pretty disappointed, and I was ready to bail out a few times looking for an emergency escape pod. But the Lord kept reinforcing to my heart, Scott, you got to practice this text. Don't fear, stand firm, keep your eyes on me, and just be silent. And y'all, the Lord has come through, and the past couple days, huge improvement. But I'm just telling y'all, we all have chances to practice this in real time. So let's keep reading in our passage because we're approaching the most climactic part of the story here. All right, let's go to verse 19. Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Y'all, here we go. It's getting good now. Let's notice. God's going to show up here in two major ways, and we've just seen the first. The first is a defense against the opposition. The angel of the Lord has moved from guiding the people forward to guarding them against their enemy. There's this miraculous cloud that kept somehow things dark for the Egyptians and visible for the Hebrews all night long. It's amazing. So this is all a very defensive position where the Lord provides our defense. And it calls to mind countless Psalms of David, recognizing Yahweh as his shield and defense, his strong tower protecting him against any who would seek his downfall. It also brings to mind the armor of God in Ephesians 6, where the Lord gives us a full defense to put on every day. Not sending us to go out on the offense to fight back, but to be fully prepared to resist our enemy. So this is all the first way that we can look to the Lord and expect him to show up. And he does it with the Hebrews, stepping in to provide a defense. And let's keep reading for what follows. In verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. There it is. This is the moment that people have attempted to portray in cinema a few times. It's one of the greatest displays of supernatural power ever recorded in the Bible. And it's the second way that God's intervening here. First was to defend them against their opposition, and now it's to provide a miraculous way forward. Y'all, for God to separate waters and create dry ground that's safe to walk on, it's such a throwback to previous biblical themes. It's the same powers that were at play at creation when the word of the Lord separated waters from the dry land. And it's a parallel theme to the great flood, where the Lord preserved his people through the surging waters of the flood, through the safety of the ark. And closer to home, it even calls back Moses' own origin story, where his very life was preserved from Pharaoh's attempt to eliminate the Hebrew babies by being sent out onto the water in a basket. Moses' very name reflects this in its meaning, taken up out of the water. And so what a powerful fulfillment we see here as Moses helps the entire nation to be preserved through the water. Now I know many of us can't help but wonder about all this. What are the logistics of the story? How did this happen? What are the natural components versus the supernatural and miraculous aspects of this? Y'all, to be clear, scholars have put a lot of time into asking hard questions and studying the text and analyzing the geography and the archaeological research here. One of the biggest questions that's typically asked is, where specifically did this occur? Unfortunately, there's a vast array of ideas and opinions out there and very little agreement. Some scholars translate this as the Red Sea, just like the body of water that we know today, versus there's others who think it's a mistranslation of the concept, the Reed Sea, that maybe points to a smaller body of water, maybe some fresh water. For example, people wonder, is this the Bitter Lakes that now make up part of the Suez Canal? Does this take away from the supernatural impact of the story to try to reduce the scale of this to a smaller body of fresh water? I don't know. Others would ask, is it really believable that this crossing was part of the actual ocean? Ultimately, there's one commentator out there that says everybody's guessing. So good luck. I don't know. I would say this also has us ask questions like what kinds of natural phenomena could explain this? Could there be a natural weather event like a tornado or a hurricane that could blow back the water and the Lord used it here? Or some people wonder, did the people wade through shallow water? If so, then how did God drown the Egyptian army in this? Or maybe that makes it all the more powerful. What I'll tell y'all today is you can rest assured there are a lot of very real and concrete possibilities for how this happened in the actual geography. There's just not a lot of consensus or agreed upon ideas of the real location. We're going to have to wait until heaven to fully understand how this went down in detail. But until then, y'all, we can appreciate and we can bask in awe and wonder at the miraculous nature of God's divine intervention and this display of his power. One thing's for sure, the parting of the Red Sea has become a seminal story that has grown to be foundational, a really true motif in biblical literature for many years to come. It reminds me of the reassurance that God gave the nation of Israel 600 years later after the Red Sea event through the prophet Isaiah, as he wrote, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." And who could forget the early miracle of Jesus when he shows up to calm the storm in Mark chapter 4, where once again we see God's divine authority and his power over the waters on display. Exodus 14, it just tells such an essential, critical story of God rescuing his people, and the ripple effect of this narrative for years to come is very powerful. And we haven't even ended the story, have we? So let's keep reading to see what comes next in verse 23. It says, "The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, 'Let us flee before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians.'" So y'all, God's not done with his display of power. And the drama of the scene is only upping the ante here with this powerful enemy pursuing right behind the Hebrews. Just when they thought the coast was clear, here comes their enemy again. And yet we see the Egyptians themselves starting to crack. They're starting to panic a little, thinking, this may not have been the best idea for us. And so verse 27, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. There it is, y'all. The story isn't over until the Lord has dealt with his enemies. And I don't want that to suggest that God is cruel or vengeful or delights in punishing humankind, but it does mean he is not a passive doormat. He doesn't let evil or wickedness or human cruelty just slide by. The biblical narrative is clear. Those who oppose the Lord ultimately and refuse to respond to his grace will be punished for sin. And the Egyptians here, they receive an element of divine justice. It's called talionic justice, where the penalty is fitting and equivalent to the very offense that happened. Since Egypt, just a few years previously, had participated in drowning the children of Israel in the Nile and then oppressed them for 400 years. I find it particularly compelling that the same instrument that God uses for the salvation for some is also the instrument of death for others, those that chose that fate. So in the same way that Paul describes the gospel in 1 Corinthians 1 to be a stumbling block and foolishness for some, but the power and the wisdom of God for others, So often that's how God works, y'all. He's offering himself equally to all, but not everyone responds the same way to the Lord. And the results can be perilous like they were for the Egyptians. So I'd ask you today, how do you respond to the grace of God? Is his grace a path forward, a way through the water that builds your faith and your trust in him? Or is God's grace something that you'd rather ignore? A frustrating dynamic that sometimes you'd just rather live without? I'd caution every one of us to carefully weigh this in our hearts and our souls in light of today's message. And so now, to cap off our story, let's read the final synopsis in verse 29. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Y'all, I love that this is the end result of the story, that the people fear God and believe in him, because that's what God is after. He's interested in his people's hearts. He wants their affections to remain on him. And doesn't he deserve it? Anything else would be lesser and unworthy for our affections. Also, numerous times through this story, the Lord has already said that he's going to show up and rescue his people and display his power so that Pharaoh or the Egyptians in general, or certainly his own people, would know that he is God and believe in him. That's what he's after. Unfortunately, the Egyptians just didn't grasp this. But the Hebrews did, and by the far shore of the sea, they were able to reflect in awe of the true Lord who was in their midst, and they could revere and they could worship him with integrity. And I know what some of us are thinking. It doesn't necessarily last very long for them, because shortly we know that in the wilderness they're going to complain again. They're going to eventually turn to a golden calf to put their faith into. They're human, right? But at least for now, by the end of this chapter, the people are walking by faith. They've learned to fear God in reverence and respect. And they've learned to believe in his power and to trust his fatherly heart of protection over them. So that takes us to our last point today, the last question I'd ask of you like this. When God's power intervenes to save you, will you believe in him? When God shows up into your desperate situation, are your eyes open to recognize him? Is your grip on the steering wheel of your life loose enough to offer him the room to take some control and provide some direction and guidance? I wonder, where are you on this right now? Y'all, no matter how far away God may feel to some of you, I'm confident he has intervened into your life. You may not feel comfortable with that concept or that phrase, but I believe it's true. Even in subtle ways, the Lord has been at work in the wings of your life. He's been maneuvering in the background or even showing up in the foreground in ways that you could never deny or ignore. Most importantly, Parkway, his ultimate intervention happened at the cross. In the greatest and most impactful way possible, the Lord recognized our desperate situation of being stuck in our sin, and he stepped in to rescue us by sending his son to die on the cross as our substitute. There's no greater way that God could have demonstrated his love and his faithfulness to you than what he's already done. So let's review what we've talked about today. In light of the Hebrews' experience at the Red Sea, we're asking ourselves these three important questions. First, when God leads you into desperate situations, will you depend on him? Second, when your back is up against the wall, will you turn to despair? And then finally, when God's power intervenes to save you, will you believe in him. Y'all, one of the ways that we as a church are going to be practicing looking to the Lord together, it's coming up this very evening. We've told you about it. Rachel mentioned it earlier. Just like the Hebrews followed God into the parted waters, tonight at our Multiply meeting, we're going to celebrate and we're going to talk about where God is leading us as a church into the future. So I really hope we'll get to see you there as we reflect upon and pray over our next steps as a church with regard to multiplication in this new season. But in closing today, my friends, may we continue to practice looking to the Lord for rescue whenever the situation looks dire. Instead of sinking back into fear, let's choose to trust in the power of our great God who is mighty to save. Would you pray with me? Lord, we really do look to you, and we choose to put our trust and our hope and our faith and our dependence in you. God, we're very familiar with the concept of desperate situations. Every one of us has felt it intimately. And so, Lord, would you continue to strengthen us and empower us to place our trust and our dependence in you and nothing else. Lord, we thank you for being a God who has a heart of rescue, who sees us in our desperation and is moved to go towards us and to save us. God, we look to you and we glorify you and we worship you. And we want to do that right now as we turn our hearts back towards you. We love you and we praise you, and we pray these things in the holy name of Jesus. Amen.